Welcome everybody, including Malcolm Fairbrother.
Need a chair.
Yeah, you need a chair. You don't have a chair? You have a chair position in Uppsala. Isn't that enough? How many chairs do you need? Good. I'm very happy to have Daniel Waldenström here. He's going to talk about richer and more equal, a new history of wealth in the West, which sounds interestingly controversial. Daniel actually, like some people, have two PhD. He did his first in economics at Department of Economics, Stockholm School of Economics. Essays in historical finance. Sounds very interesting, I haven't read. And he received his second PhD in one of my favorite subjects, in economic history at the Department of Economic History of Lund University. Dissertation, Lifting All Boats. So it seems to be a little bit connected to this book, actually. The evolution of income and wealth inequality over the path of development. And you are between 2011 and 2016, you were a professor at the Department of Economics at Uppsala. And then you've been for probably a lovely time. You were a visiting professor at Paris School of Economics between 2015 and 2019. And since 2018 you are an associate professor in economic history at Lund, but now you are the professor of economics and director of taxes and society research program at the Research Institute of Industrial Economics. I think I got most there. Very welcome. He has written these two books. Actually, it's the same book, but in two different languages. I'm going to send them around. So you can pass them around so you can have a look at them. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustav, and thank you, the Institute for Future Studies, for inviting me here to talk about topics that are not only my work but also my hobby. It's about inequality, distribution, redistribution, and history, and also policy. So there are a lot of thoughts, I think, in your head when it comes to these questions. These are broadly discussed questions and topics throughout the world, I would say, but specifically also the Western world. So as the title suggests, this is a historical endeavor that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about specifically some aspects of equality and inequality when it comes to wealth holding. So inequality is a very complex topic. As for housekeeping, I will be happy to take questions meanwhile, but I also know that we will have a discussion afterwards. So I will try to be as speedy as I can to maximize the kind of discussion time afterwards. But by all means, ask any clarifying questions, because many of these things that we're going to talk about are not so easy when it comes to inequality, welfare, measurement, when it comes to specifically the outcome of wealth. I'm just hinting that it's not that easy always. So if you have any idea or like any clarifying questions or anything, please let me know. I mean, I'd be happy to
Actually,
try
let
to
me
clarify.
know and I will call on you.
Exactly. So anyway, so broadly speaking, wealth. What is wealth? What do we own? In terms of what is the concept of wealth? What does it contain? Richness, fortunes, but also people's savings and so on. So that is one question that I'm going to ask, and then we're going to talk about who owns wealth. Gaps, inequality. These are the focus of this talk and also of the book that I've been writing, and also my research over the past 20 plus years. The distribution of economic well-being and wealth holding. History, as I said, is one of the themes of this book. We're going to talk about history both in terms of trying to explain history, and this is a specific topic when it comes to wealth and income inequality and its trends in the Western world, because it has been discussed specifically by my former colleague Thomas Piketty, and one of his main contributions has been to try to explain the changes over time, and then to draw lessons from that into the future. So the historical development, how it has come about, is one very important topic that we are going to talk about today. And finally, also then lessons for the future. What are the implications from thinking about the distribution, thinking about society? And since as mentioning then Thomas Piketty, he was my colleague. He was the one inviting me to Paris, and we've been basically talking and discussing and doing research about these topics since the early 2000s. he has kind of provided what you could call the dominant narrative. In the book, I call it the old narrative. It's a little bit so there's always a challenge of not like doing straw manning or like. So that's of course I want to portray what he has been trying to say in such clear manner that it still is very clear what he does and trying to distill his thoughts. So and then I think we could think about two main themes when it comes to understanding the long run evolution of inequality, specifically in terms of wealth. The first one is about, and the overarching title of these two kind of themes is "The rich are the problem." So that is kind of something that comes back again and again when I think dominating in both Thomas' thinking, but also many of people's thinking in the inequality research literature. When it comes to wealth equalization over time, because that's a fact. We're going to use the same data, actually. Thomas has kind of focused as basic explanation as taking down the rich. So the decrease of wealth holdings in the top of the distribution has been the main or key driver behind the documented equalization of wealth holding over the 20th century. And this has come about through two kind of key channels. One is shocks to capital, or key channels in terms of shocks to capital. One is the wars, the world wars over the 20th century. So that these wars were kind of exogenous shocks that destroyed the holdings of the rich. So factories were bombed or infrastructure and so on, quite concretely. During the wars, there were also regulative changes that also hampered the wealth of the rich. So this is one of the key drivers of taking down the top of the distribution to create equalization. The other one is taxation, specifically capital taxation, redistributing from the rich to the rest or to the poor. Typically not to the poor directly because we don't know exactly where it's going to end. But still, those two channels have been kind of the key drivers of equalization over time, according to that narrative. And then Walter Scheidel, a professor at Stanford, has kind of emphasized the role of wars as like wars are a necessary condition for sustained wealth equalization, truly highlighting the role of these exogenous shocks to capital and to the rich. The other kind of theme I think that one needs to have in mind when thinking about also the implications and its interpretation is that the rich are, they do not contribute to society very much. Many of them are problematic. They may be successful, but why are they successful? Luck is one component, of course, inheritance. So it could also be corruption, theft, or other kinds of structures. And I think these are factors that we know are behind some of the big fortunes that we see, specifically in other non-Western parts of the world where democracy is not really at hand. We have corruption also in the Eastern Europe, for example, the old socialist republics where oligarchs have kind of come about large pools of wealth through non-market channels, you could say. By the way, in the sense of luck, one of my all-time favorite books is the book called Success and Luck by Robert Franks, Cornell professor. It's a really interesting view of thinking about our inherent tendency to downplay the role of luck in our own lives. I think specifically about, among those people here, we think that we're here because we worked so hard and we have some talent and so on. And we don't, tend to not see all the things that have kind of contributed us being here. I mean, among other things, of course, just being in this rich country. I mean, place ourselves in the Afghanistan countryside, and then we'll see who's going to end up here at the end of the day. Anyway, so of course these things are important as well. But as a main driver of wealth generation, the role of entrepreneurs are not there. They are not it's a very static view of the world. And also when it comes to inequality, so changes in inequality, increases in inequality are typically interpreted as something bad. And I think we can all think about situations where income creation, wealth creation, dynamism, increase gaps between those who do things and those who are not so active. And amongst those who do things are people maybe creating companies, products, services that we use and benefit from, jobs, incomes, and also taxes. And then that where we have a situation where inequality goes hand in hand with expansion and of the size of the economic pie. Anyway, so I think more complex view of what actually is inequality and how it matters for society. Okay, now we spent quite some time on that. After Thomas Piketty wrote his world-famous book by now, Capital in the 21st Century, the literature on wealth inequality has continued to grow and become, I think, much more nivelated and nuanced. In fact, in ways that actually make us land at a situation where the facts and also interpretations have drifted away from that narrative that I just portrayed. So that equalization came about through taking down the top. That is what's kind of historically has been forwarded as an explanation. So instead, I think, looking at the facts, actually the same facts, the same data, these are three historical wealth facts that I think are kind of coming out of that. I think if you, these facts, if you have them with you, I think I'd be very happy. So first, we are richer today. This is maybe not very controversial. I think, in fact, something that we can see around us all the time. Yes, Malcolm.
What year is your baseline?
Oh, well, we can play around with baselines. I will come back to that. So we can think about, starting years, ending years, that's a classical playground for wanting to push certain themes and or conclusions. But in this first fact, it doesn't matter. We're richer than 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 100 years ago. So we're better off. We didn't get hip surgeries for everybody 50 years ago, or the people say, like, after 1980 everything went to hell. Well, I don't think so. We're pretty happy we're not at 1980 point in many ways.
But I guess you don't take in the natural stock in that, I mean, because that's complicated.
Pardon?
What's left in our natural stock?
No. So that's I mean, one of the themes that we may want to discuss afterwards also when it comes to thinking about the broader boundaries. I will talk about public sector holdings a little bit, so national wealth. And I will also, I mean, so there are a lot of complexities and additional perspectives. So I will add some of those, but I'm sure, and I think there will be even more as we continue to discuss. Wealth is different today when it comes to the composition of wealth. Who holds, what kind of wealth do we have in our economies? And also, we are more equal today. So here again, of course, Malcolm's question, what is this endpoint and the starting point and endpoint? This is something we're truly discussing. You will see it in the data. By the way, all my data are freely downloadable at my website, so you can all the Excel files and so. So there's free to play around with these things. So just to state so this is a graph showing average per capita private sector wealth in the Western world, at least in the 6 countries for which I have my main sample, is the US, UK, France, Germany, Spain, Sweden. This could be income. This could be a lot of things. It just shows that we are expanding the values in our economies. We do things better and create more value in different and there are factors behind this is, of course, many. Could be, I mean, think technological change, globalization, and then institutions and so on. I will come back to that. The other thing about wealth is different today. I think this is a key graph. So we think sometimes about wealth, the wealthy. People are rich. 100 years ago, so this picture shows you over the history of the past 130 years, when we look at the cross-section of all wealth. So in each point in time, we take all the holdings that people have, the wealth, and we divide the assets that are part of it, contained in wealth, into 2 categories. One, which is homes and pension funds, you could say, the homes that we own, and also the long-term savings, what I call pension funds. So be mutual funds today, could be some other kind of scheme, but there are accounts with names on it. That was about 1/4 of all wealth a century ago. The rest was agricultural domains, these kind of landed estates, but also some directly held industrial corporations or banks. So what I could call then elite wealth.
Quick clarification question. So you have all the pensions taken state pension, but you don't have claims like free schoolings as part
No,
of that.
and here we
That would
don't.
strengthen your point, actually.
No, but actually, I will come back to that. But here, it's not that I have. I don't have the present. So when it comes to pension values, pension funds, there's one part which is about accounts with your name on it. So like a mutual fund, but maybe in the Swedish context, we have an occupational pension scheme like AMF, or I don't know if you have Alecta or some scheme where you can choose maybe a global fund or some kind of insurance setup. That's going to be here. Then there's another thing where it's like a defined benefit context, a pay-as-you-go pension. We have basically you pay a tax or a social security contribution, and then you get a promise for a future pension, and that's kind of another part which is not part of this one. It's gonna. I will have that as an extension analysis in the end. The key message of this graph is how the importance of those two assets that matter for most of these people, namely our homes and our pension funds, have increased in value and in importance in total wealth over time. So today, we have like 75-80%. The vast majority of all wealth, including all these billionaire corporations and all that, and yachts and private jets and so on, still, most of wealth in society is what we own. Our homes, our apartments, our long-term savings. That means so when also that has implications, of course, for when asset prices go up, when the stock market goes up, who benefits from that? Well, a lot of you guys, since you have your pension funds often invested in the stock markets. And also when house prices go up, of course, this is the middle class who are going to benefit a lot from that. And this is just facts again. When it comes to the distributional outcomes then. So this picture shows you one variant of wealth equality over time. I will show a few more graphs. This one shows you the total value of wealth first amongst the top percentile in the distribution. So imagine that you have all households lined up from poorest to richest, and we divide the population into 100 equally sized groups, and then we take the richest 100th, the top percent, and all their wealth, and then we divide. We take all their wealth to begin with. Then we see that value. These are kind of fixed price, constant prices. So the total amount of their wealth is actually bigger than the total amount of the all what is owned by the bottom 90%, the 9/10ths in the bottom of the distribution. And look, 100 years ago, that elite owned maybe 4 or 5 times what the rest of the population owned. But then we see over the 20th century how the growth in popular wealth has been quite marked, this dashed blue line, and has surpassed in total amounts the wealth of the rich. Of course, per capita within these groups, we have much higher values in the red line, right? Another interesting feature here is how the late era with globalization, technical change, we have big tech companies in the US, a lot of billionaires having experienced high value increases of their ownership. That has not crowded out the wealth increases in the broader layers of the population. So it's a kind of exhibit A against a zero-sum view of the world. That says that if someone gets more, someone else has to get less. So, in fact, here we have an expansion of the economic pie. It's both the top and the bottom. Now, these are just facts, but I think this comes again in so many ways. But it has to be emphasized.
Is this robust if you go for 0.1%? Will it look exactly the same?
I think maybe if you have like the zero-sum, if you look at the 0.1% or 0.01% or the top 10, the richest persons, maybe their development would be even more skyrocketing. And so that's, that becomes a little bit more jumpy. During 2022, I think Klarna, this Swedish company called Klarna, their total stock value, market cap, decreased by 85%. Because they were highly valued, a lot of expectations and so on. As Tesla went down by 65% in value. So it becomes jumpier, but yes. This is another view of equality, wealth inequality over time. The most common way to measure wealth inequality over time is the top percent share. So these richest guys in the top 100th divided by the total wealth. And what we see here, this is actually quite fascinating graph, and I think this is one of the key graphs of this scheme. I've divided them into two, which is because I wanted to separate the US and Europe. Here we see over the 20th century a very stark equalizing pattern in all of Europe. This is and coming from very high inequality 100 years ago. In fact, the UK, the blue here, I think, if I've done my research right, I think this level of wealth concentration that we witnessed in Europe, in UK in 1910, I think it's the highest degree of wealth concentration that any country or any region has ever experienced in mankind's history. Anyway, so then during the 20th century, we saw this enormous equalization in all of these countries. And here is another indication of the drivers. The role of wars, which has been then highlighted, is the exogenous shock as a key explanation, as a necessary condition for equalization. It's actually quite interesting how here we have some belligerent countries, the UK, France, Germany, yes. But we know their experiences during the First World War and Second World War were quite different. But also we have Spain and Sweden, who were never part of those wars. And also in my book I looked at the Spanish Civil War, but this does not show any very strong support for these kind of war times as being keys for understanding wealth equalization over time. The second quite fascinating fact here is what happens in the last decades. So here we saw that wealth values, stock markets, house prices, everything, I mean, has increased several hundreds of % in all of these Western economies. What has happened to wealth concentration? It's almost it's stuck at historically low levels. I mean, we see some changes. In the US was more equal 100 years ago, and it has also experienced more. I have three very unpedagogical, three different US here, because it's in the US there's a debate a little bit of how to measure wealth inequality amongst some economists and so on. Here, and talking to Malcolm's question about starting point, ending point. So most people ask about what has happened since 1980. So when we look at crime, we think about what has happened over the last 2 years, or school performance over the last maybe back to 5 years. For inequality, it should always be what has happened since 1980. It's a long time, but it's something. It's a almost rhetorical starting point. But what has happened in European wealth concentration since 1980? I mean, here we also have Canada and Australia. Actually, not that much. We can see here that these countries have experienced a wealth concentration that has this. I mean, we see some variations, of course, but it's kind of within a band of plus minus 20%, plus minus 5%, maybe over this almost half a century long period now. It's at least 40%, but I think this is a little bit going back to the 70s. These are the facts. And I just saw a new paper. So when the Danish paper came out with the green line here, where we have top of the line data, and still since 1990 in Denmark, nothing has happened for wealth concentration. I saw a new paper a couple of weeks ago in Tampere, Belgium paper showing the same data, same results, long historic equalization and no explosions in wealth concentration over the last decade.
Which one has the bump in around 2000?
This is France. So it's a paper by these my old former colleagues. I think we could. I think such bumps are almost. They are typically very problematic when it comes to wealth inequality, because wealth doesn't change a lot from year to year. So I think there's a lot of estimation underlying these bumps. That bump. As for the US, then we see both a higher level of wealth concentration and also a clear upward trend. Okay, so we are both richer, more equal today. Key equalizers that I will talk about, that I will emphasize, is the combination of technological change, so industrialization and growth, GDP growth, if you may, and also inclusive institutions. So rules that made these wealth gains and value gains more widely dispersed in the populations and lifting then the bottom of the distribution, not taking down the top. Am I the only one to say this? I can just say that the history of my research has both very gradual. I started thinking about this because I thought the data said this, but I didn't dare to say anything actually, maybe over a couple of years, because it's scary to kind of depart from the mainstream in the literature, and also when it's your colleagues. But I saw a lot of youngsters coming into the literature, bending their backs to kind of acquiesce the mainstream, or like, and I felt that this is important. And I'm not the only, but I've received some support at least. So this is Daron Acemoglu, Jim Robinson, they received this economics prize. Daron wrote this endorsement for this book. Jim, I haven't asked him for the permission to highlight the email from him, but I mean, yes, I certainly think that this is the right story. So they've been kind of, and I've received a lot of positive signals from a lot of really talented researchers that I think that I get strengthened by.
Just
Yeah.
You were looking at 6 countries for all this data, 6 Western countries.
So these are my key sample. I will show you a little bit some other countries as well, in some strains of data. But for my main sample, I have 6 countries.
Because you talked about inclusive institutions there, but that doesn't seem to be the explanation for China.
No, definitely not. So let's. So we are talking about the Western world. When it comes to wealth, so this is just like to say that wealth, as I measure, and this is a standard measure that statistical agencies, researchers use, basically the sum of all assets minus liabilities. So we're going to talk about net wealth. With assets, we have either the property, like our homes, land, and so on. These are the non-financial assets. We have the financial assets, bank accounts or cash, stocks and bonds, and so on, and also mutual funds and pension funds. Liabilities is typically mortgages. In the most, so we have maybe at 1/10 is student loans in some of these Western countries, and again, special moments or problematic aspects. So hidden wealth. What about rich hiding their assets in tax havens? I have chapter 7 in the book deals with this specifically. Public sector wealth, we already touched upon this. So the promises from the public that maybe both by taxing you cannot save privately, meaning that typically people don't become as wealthy as they could otherwise have been, but in return they get values in terms of services, schools for kids and so on, or maybe retired, incomes or help when they get sick and so on. And here that's a kind of a systematic question. In some countries maybe we take down taxes and then you save privately instead. So here in chapter 8, I do a little bit of a calculation. I'm not the first one to do this. This is kind of, people are doing this. Martin Feldstein, a US economist, did this, talked about this a lot in the 70s. Inherited wealth is another dimension that is also kind of another kind of view of wealth holding that is kind of also interesting in many ways. Age wealth profile, I just wanted to show this. Also highlighting that wealth is a problematic outcome in a sense. And actually I write a little bit about this when it comes to poverty, for example. So we see a hump shape in the average value of wealth in over our life cycle. So basically we save and save and save when we work and so on, and then up until when we retire, and after that we consume. According to the kind of most stylized model, we're going to consume down to zero. So we're going to end up with no wealth. So therefore, why is there inheritance in the first place? That's a challenge to understand. Accidental bequests are like there. I mean, there's anyway. But this means in practice that a lot of the wealth poor people are just young people. In fact, almost a majority of them are young households that have not just yet been able to build wealth. Gives us another, take-home message in understanding what kind of poverty do we want to talk about. I don't think that wealth is a kind of the best measure to use when addressing poverty issues, rather than income or like some consumption maybe. I mean, those are much more important when addressing poverty problems. So again, what happened then over time? Why did we have this lift? What has happened, and why did we see this shift in popular wealth, where homes and pensions became a dominant share of all assets? I think these two components are the explanations. Both we had the economic growth, the technical change. So this is, of course, industrial revolution. So my topic, or my discipline, economic history, that is the discipline that it's kind of defined by the study of the Industrial Revolution. That has kind of took mankind from the stationary more or less. There's another literature about how stationary were we, but nonetheless, economic growth, but also these key aspects of how growth is distributed, namely the democratic shocks or revolutions in the early 20th century with this universal suffrage extensions and so on, that led also to the extension of educational attainment, both broadly for the lower in the lower parts, but also for access to higher education, labor laws, restricting conditions in the working place, regulating that made workers more productive, raised their wages, gave them more income, and then allowed them to start saving for the first time. Before they just had to eat everything because they were so poor, but now they were able to start saving. The first thing they saved for was a home. And then as our countries or economies grew wealthier, we started living longer. We were doing things better, building institutions. Then we needed to start saving for old age. That is kind of, and looking at the data, Sebastian Kohl is a German, I think, sociologist, maybe some of you know him, has been creating a database on home ownership rates. This is just highlighting the fact that over the 20th century, more and more households start owning their homes. And this is because they started having an income. We also had this financial sector or credit market development. But then in order to take a loan, you need to have an income to be able to repay it. So that's very good. It goes hand in hand. So the home ownership rates go up. And this is once again that the increasing popular wealth and its importance is a key exhibit, key component in that. And this other one is about yes.
We have a question.
Yeah.
Microphone.
Okay.
I was wondering about Germany. In all these exhibits that you've shown, it is an oddball. Not an
Absolutely.
outlier, but I wondered a bit about the institutional moorings of these deviations. Yeah.
I was afraid that you were going to ask something like that because it's like it's always. I mean, now we're in Sweden. The most scary thing is when coming to another country and they start asking you questions about that kind of country estimates and so on. So Germany, Austria have the lowest home ownership rates, I think, in Europe for various reasons. And I can just say from the other part of the ladder, so we don't have them here, but Eastern Europe, they have more than 90% home ownership rates, which is then even up here, which is I think has to do with the transition from the socialist era. Why does Germany have such a low home ownership rate? I don't know exactly. I think I've read about this. Tons of reasons. So let's come back to this and.
Because also the other exhibits when it came to contribution of health, like it was fairly.
I know. And actually, Germany, they have a poor middle class in that sense, and they actually this potential. I have a graph where I plot the home ownership rates and wealth inequality. I think it's actually they have relatively higher wealth inequality because of this. Let me come back to that. Sorry for being so uninformed. Yes. So I'll show you a little bit at least on the macro on the kind of this kind of as a composition. This is just showing you that at some point we started accumulating pension savings. Why? I think this is a key driver, of course. We started living much longer because of the growth of our economies. So here, these graphs are from 1980, just showing you that pension funds, the value of pension funds in total. I also have a graph on their share of people's wealth is increasing. I mean, there's a lot of things happening here. I think one of the main also reasons for this is the financial innovation that came in the 1980s that changed most of our savings patterns. What was that? So that was a mutual fund that all of a sudden allowed us normal people without no skills in finance or so having access to the high returns on the stock market and corporate sector at low risk. without needing to be experts on different individual companies, we could just put the money in a mutual fund. And this has kind of revolutionized people's savings patterns and has benefited a lot also when it comes to capturing also the gains that has come through the globalization, technical change over the last decades. So we see this is kind of mirrored also in the pension fund explosions. So on these 6 countries, these are just aggregates. This pattern about the rise of popular wealth, these 2 components, home values, and also pension savings. We see there are some. This is like annual data. Showing some degree of variation across these countries, but it's still quite fascinating how similar they are over time, still coming from 20-25% 100 years ago to 80-something, 75% today. But as you can see, the composition of homes and pension funds is a little bit different across these countries. Wealth inequality, yes, you already seen the kind of the main patterns. We usually measure wealth inequality historically by using the top wealth share measure. It's the Gini coefficient, and there are other kind of. I've done a lot of inequality research. Some inequality researchers, they only do research about measurements. They love doing that. So statistically linking it to normative literature and so aspects and so on. The top wealth shares is kind of a pragmatic measure, allowing us to use data maybe very well measured for the rich. The early tax systems focus on the rich, that's where the money was, right? And also relating that to estimates of the total, and not knowing so much about the middle. I have a little bit of data for a few countries, but so that's why we have top wealth shares and also top income shares for these long periods. So this is just showing you again the main driver, the main trends. A huge wealth equalization over the 20th century, seen also in the US, but much less to lesser extent. Gustav asked about these 6 countries and others. So there are some other countries for which we have data, and of course we want to check how exceptional are these 6 countries in the main sample. These 6 countries are there because we have data on them in the most all of the relevant dimensions, but there are some data on long-term or like in wealth inequality for other countries as well. These are these 8. And in the gray lines are kind of mapped the 6 countries that I talked about, and then this is not a statistical test. So, but it's kind of a robustness check on how representative are the main trends in terms of equalization. I would say, we see relatively similar patterns over time. Netherlands, Australia for the long term, Canada data and Finland. So,
is the oil fund in Norway? People's claim on the oil fund?
No, I don't think so.
That would make a big difference.
That would be a big difference. It would be maybe then much lower. That's right. So exactly. So anyway, so this is just to show you that these 6 countries are not exceptional. I think they're in fact quite kind of all encompassing when it comes to these long run trends. But of course, there are differences and evaluations of wealth in the very top. So here, if you go to the richest percentile, within the richest percentile, the top 0.1%, the top 10,000th. So one question, did they evade the great equalization of wealth over the 20th century? No. Their relative wealth share also decreased over the 20th century. But we also can see a clearer upturn over the last years. And this is something we can just open our newspapers and see, the amounts of wealth that's around. In the US, you can see it's a very stark increase in wealth concentration and in the wealth of the very top relative to others. And here, of course, soon we're going to get down to a short list of names, the Forbes magazine and so on. But this is at least, so these are still within our main data, in the broader patterns that you saw. But when we go up finer in the top, then we see the variations of what's happening. And this is also part of our understanding. So when it comes to role of wars and capital taxes, they did matter for wealth equalization. This graph shows you inheritance tax rates over the 20th century, and this data from Ken Sheev and David Stasavich to political scientists. what they show is that, so in terms of inheritance taxation, it didn't really pick up until the mid 20th century, quite some time after wealth had already started equalizing. The other kind of, and almost anecdotal part of this empirical evidence is that amongst countries who equalized at similar rates, we still had quite large differences in how high these capital taxes were. So the extent of capital taxation differed across these countries quite a bit, yet they all experience the same equalization rates. So yet, of course, there's a lot of nuances in here, but we have a lot of potentially marginal effects that could matter. I haven't seen any such papers. But anyway, kind of the factors driving down as trying to explain equalization by saying we take down the rich. I'm not totally convinced. In fact, but instead, when we try to look at the data, and we can decompose the top wealth share, we can decompose, comparing the changes in the top and the changes in the bottom, and this also connects to the macro picture of the change of wealth in the top. What was the wealth in the top? Well, the elite wealth was kind of the corporate stocks, and I will show you a little bit more of data on that as well. And also the agrarian estate. So we had the landed aristocracy and so on. And in the bottom then, the changes, people's homes and their long-term savings. So when we can basically look at the wealth share, the top wealth share, and link that to the macro evidence, and at least what do you say? In a broader sense. And then we get this. So this picture, I think, is quite important and it's quite telling. So it shows you average annual changes in 3 outcomes. So the white bar is the top wealth share. Here, so we have minuses here. This connects to this long-term decrease of the top wealth share. So the long-term equalization during 2 time periods, 1910 to 50, 50 to 80. Was this fall in wealth concentration driven by taking down the rich, and the average annual change in the wealth of the rich is the dark blue panels, bars, and then, or was it driven by lifting the bottom, the expansion of ownership amongst normal workers, middle class people? That's a light blue, and I think it's obvious that it's lifting people's ownership, including people in the productive economy, allowing them to start saving and investing in housing, pension funds, or what have you, which is the driver behind this wealth decrease. In fact, on average, the wealth of the rich did not decrease over this period. In fact, it increased in the post-war decades, but it just didn't increase as fast as the growth of wealth of the middle class and the working class. Over the last period, we see this increase in wealth concentration. This includes also the US. This is a kind of average of all Western countries. This shows you, this is explained by an exceptional increase amongst in the top. But it's not crowded out wealth, at least it has coincided with a continued wealth increase in the middle class. Again, then talking against the zero-sum view of the world. So now, bear with me. Now I'm going to give you some data, also a little bit on Sweden, in fact. So showing you a little bit more granularity.
5 minutes left.
5 minutes left. That's good. Max. Okay, good. That's going to be that is just showing you the plot of the kind of role of home ownership and wealth inequality. That's the plot I talked about. I mean, in fact, I think that I never had, almost in very few of my papers, I had this kind of nice scatter plot with this line fits. It typically looks much more chaotic, but it just shows you that higher home ownership rates goes hand in hand with lower wealth inequality. Okay, some recent data on Sweden, but now I will try to be a little bit faster. This is just showing you individual data on Sweden, and I will come back to this later this year with more data on the Swedish wealth inequality as of today. But it just emphasizes that pension savings and homes are the dominant assets in people's portfolios up until the very top when we have directly held shares. So when we go to the very top, we have corporate assets being the dominant part of ownership. So it's kind of, and this emphasizes that the rich here are largely entrepreneurial groups. So people owning, creating companies. These are the ones, and this fits back to the view of what are the role of entrepreneurs in society, and who are the rich. Oh, okay, I will skip through that because I don't have time. So look also then at some of these other dimensions. Hidden wealth in tax havens has been a big topic, and one, of course, measurement aspect is this equalization just an artifact of measurement problems? Is it that the rich have they are still equally relatively rich, but it's just that they started hiding their wealth to a large extent? It doesn't appear to be that way. In fact, in the aggregate, the estimates of hidden wealth, offshore wealth, are not very large in the aggregate, and they don't change a lot the levels of wealth inequality, even when we add them to the wealth of the richest. In fact, this is something that has also become even more so today. The wealth hidden abroad is actually decreasing, and this is, I think, is an interesting aspect of understanding perhaps one of the most successful international cooperation institutions that have been created over the last years, namely OECD's information exchange agreements, where the countries have bilaterally and multilaterally been engaged in sharing information about people's holdings, about terror financing, but also about tax avoidance and so on. And that, I think, could be an interesting role model for other kind of international cooperation platforms. I mean, how to solve taxation of carbon dioxide or pollution, or how to think about where do we find good examples of international collaborations. I think the OECD information exchange has been one of such examples. Another one, now we talked about pay-as-you-go pensions, these promises. So what if the thought experiment here is to think about your taxes that you pay and you get in return future pension income. Think instead that you have put in taken these taxes and put them into an account and saved. What would that do to wealth inequality? So first of all, we see that these are large amounts. So there's a large values in the public pension systems with these pay-as-you-go pension systems, and when we add them to the wealth distribution, to people's wealth holding, does it shift the long-term equalization, showing the rate that we are more equal today? No, it strengthens it, it magnifies it. So the top 1% share is actually, it drops by half, both in the Sweden and in the US. So these are orders of magnitude of wealth and value creation in our welfare societies generated over the 20th century. Now, also then we expand it into the wealth dimension. Female-male wealth gap is another dimension. I have a little bit of a section on that in the book. It also shows that the gap between male and female wealth has decreased over the 20th century, at least not going in the other way. Instead, also in that dimension, we seem to be more equal today. Black-white wealth gap, there's a paper in the QJE showing that it has also decreased. This is a US paper. It's not zero. It's still a substantial gap, but it's decreasing, and it has not increased a lot over the last years. Lifespans. Maybe some people here are working on this. So we can use the mortality data to calculate Gini coefficients or inequality in how long we live, longevity. Also shows that we are much more equal in the inequality of lifespans over the past 150 years, and it doesn't show any signs of having some inequality reversal. It just continues going hand in hand with development. And also finally, globally. So I talked about the West. So this is a picture showing data on global wealth since 2000. The world is a richer place today than it was 20 years ago. So these are just global wealth, and then. In global
what are you comparing, countries or individuals?
This is individuals, but this is kind of summing up all individual wealth across all countries, and then we have individuals. So thinking about the world as one joint population. we see that people are richer in the world, and wealth is highly unequally held. So Gini coefficients of 90 is very, very unequal, but it goes at least downwards. It has decreased over the last 20 years. So, so as you've already heard me saying, I think we should question the zero-sum thinking when it comes to the economy and its evolution over time. I think home ownership, private pension savings have been historically the key drivers in equalizing wealth and including people to become owners and creating their own platforms in investment and saving and also what they want to do, how to live their lives. And that could also be something where we could do more in the future. Taxation is not a key theme of my book. It's a key theme of my research. We should tax capital. It's part of an optimal tax system according to basically all of modern research. I think then we should focus on capital income taxes. So profit taxation, dividend incomes or realized capital gains. We should not tax stocks. That's just problematic. It doesn't work. And it has, I mean, we can come back to that, but it's a very clear lesson, I think, from tax research. Wealth and welfare. So the more private fees we have in our welfare systems, the stronger the ties to money in how the quality of welfare. Where to draw the line? This is a huge discussion. I'm just saying that one aspect of thinking about wealth inequality and its implications is about the less of that we have in our welfare system, drawing rights on schools and so on, the less problematic it becomes in other dimensions when we have gaps in ownership. Finally, power is a recurrent theme. I think many of you have, and I also was thinking about that. When thinking about power and wealth, I typically, when I go abroad, I become the biggest social democrat of everybody because I think we do so much right in Sweden. And here's one example. I think we are relatively good at having coinciding wealth generation, so successful entrepreneurs, and still not feeling that our political system has been basically corrupt by that. In fact, we've been able to let them work by doing what they do good, creating values, products and services and so on, and then shielding them off from politics. I mean, of course, there are ties, but at least we should have transparency. We should have maybe rules about campaign contributions. Same goes for media. So that would be, I think, the first best to think about how to combine money, value creation, and also in a more democratically embedded market economy. So there's a lot of most things, but I'm finished. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Clocking in on 54 minutes. We are now starting the question and answer period. Let me remind you that for you online, we use the chat function. And so if you wish to ask a question, you write in the chat and also write which field you have, since we like to find questions from different field. And here you put up your hand as you're doing, and this gentleman is taking it down. You also allow follow-up questions, then you put up a finger and you in the chat write who you're following up to. And when that is being arranged, I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question. And thank you very much for this. This might be more about your last slide. Went a bit quickly for this. I mean, in one way, philosophers, we don't care about income and wealth as such so much. We care about the effects of it or on well-being or something else. So that could actually strengthen your case because there's this kind of decreasing marginal utility of wealth. You don't get 1,000 times happier even if you're 1,000 times richer. But that's also an argument for why it's inefficient to have too many very rich people. You could use the money in a better way. But that's not my main question. My main question is the last slide, and it is about power. And if you think about, you mentioned it a little bit towards the end, and you think about somebody like Donald Trump, which, what is he, $400 billion, I think his net worth is, probably more than that. He donated $300 million to support Donald Trump. That's more or less what he, I think, receives in 2-3 days in his income. And the problem is here that money translates to power, and it might very well undermine, and that's what you see in the United States. This is what philosophers have been on boringly about in the seminar room for 30 years, but no one listens. It undermines liberal democracy because you can get so extreme political power, and then you get what economists call rent-seeking. They fix the rules to make even more money. And I didn't see that what you said really addressed that. And you said fix the media, and how are you going to do that? And how are you going to do it? In fact, I mean, US actually have better transparency when it comes to campaign contribution than Sweden. But you see what's happening in the United States. So I agree with all your numbers. I still worry not so much of 1%, but it's 0.01%, and its effect on liberal democracy.
Well, I share your concerns, and I think what we see in some countries, is not least the U.S., and with Melania Trump selling some picture for that's basically corruption, I think, and it's a very scary tendency. So this has been discussed. Let me say that. It was a fascinating exchange between Larry Summers and Emmanuel Saez at the Peterson Institute a few years ago. It's on online. Summers just highlights the fact that you don't need to be a billionaire in order to set up a political action committee, or we could, you could have some millions. So how to think about also what is underlying this? It becomes a little bit exposed-ish, so to highlight like Trump. Berlusconi was another kind of favorite example of this. So I think. And we should be concerned. I mean, there is grounds for having trust regulation, competitiveness regulation, and transparency, and so on. Let us also be clear about there are a few things I mentioned in my book. It's natural for society, governments, to have more exchange with the owners of our bigger corporations, and in order to understand what to do. I mean, Sweden, we built like highways to Ericsson facilities, or like Nokia. So there's like that tradition, which I think is quite natural to some extent. In fact, historically. Like taking the case of Sweden, I think the role of Marcus Wallenberg in the 60s, 70s, he was highly influential in Swedish political life as well. 100 years ago, we had the K.A. Wallenberg sitting in government. I mean, we had bankers, Rothschilds and so on. So money and power has always been a theme. It's not a new theme, and we should be concerned. Yes, I can just say that. Looking at at least then try to focus on those cases in the world where we maybe have found good solutions. Or I think public service, media supporting to smaller media outlets to counter maybe a concentration of media. I don't know. I think also then YouTube and social media is a quite interesting from below force in terms of dissemination, but with other problems, of course. So I have no clear answer. I'm just hoping to
put it this way. I mean, you talking we become more equal, and that's true when you look with your numbers on income and wealth. But it might not be true when it comes to power. We might become much more unequal, actually. And we care more about. We don't only care about income inequality. We care on wealth. We also care about power inequality. Quite important in democracies, at least.
Yeah, but that's almost an empirical question. But I think it's a very, very interesting question. And let's
it's also not only clear. It's so hard to measure power. That's why we don't do it as much.
And I think the link. So all of a sudden, what kind of wealth, or are there only certain wealthy? So there are a lot of wealthy people who are not powerful in that sense, or don't want to be that because they want to be entrepreneurs. We want to have them continue being entrepreneurs. How to fix that? That is maybe my ambition.
Good, and then we're actually going to start. Oh, it's a finger here on me, Karim.
Just very, very short to reinforce Gustav's points. There's a large number of personalist politicians, leaders that have attempted power grabs in electoral democracies that were either billionaires or had the backing of billionaires. I can just give you Silvio Berlusconi, Thaksin Shinawatra, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban. These had support of billionaires: Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, Alberto Fujimori, Jacob Zuma, and Rodrigo Duterte. So the list is very long. So this is just some.
You know, just want to say that, you know, I mean, this is a continuum. I mean, even in our liberal democracies, we have interest groups supporting. I think, in fact, if you look at the public choice understanding of what shapes politics, is that it's an outcome of interest group pressures, and the most well-organized interest groups are the ones who are going to get their views through into actual policies. So I'm just saying that. Yes, and it's very interesting, and let's do more research about this. Try to have more nivelated data and better understanding.
Okay, next is Bo Rothstein. So if you put on your microphone, and we can see you sitting in Italy, enjoying yourself.
Oh, thanks for a very interesting presentation. As Gustav, I'm a political scientist, and I'm also interested in power. And the translation between wealth and power. If you take a typical middle-class person, say he owns an apartment, or he or she, and a summer house, and has invested money in mutual funds for his or her pension, there is not much you can use as power from these assets. And I think the mutual funds are quite interesting because it hands over power to some kind of experts here. But then we have, and I would like to hear your comment on this, then we have a big change when it comes to mutual funds, and that is the index funds that are now the biggest owners of shares in the world, also on the Swedish stock market, I think. And they are interesting. First, they are very successful, usually beat the ordinary funds for various reasons. It also creates an enormous power vacuum because they are not interested in using their shares for influencing the companies. So here is a kind of power vacuum that has, I think, exploded the last 20 years. And that changes, of course, sort of what you can actually say about the connection between wealth and power. And I would like you to speculate a little what this can imply for the relation between power and wealth. I came to think of this when I presented our corruption research in Paris some 10 years ago, and one of our opponents at the seminar was Jo Stiglitz, and he was quite irritated by our measures because he thought that we were giving the United States a far too good measure. And he said, in this country, you buy elections. That's institutional corruption, he said. So, but that you cannot do if you have money in a mutual fund or in an index fund. It's kind of dead power in a way.
Okay, thank you, Bo. This is again this theme, and I think my book is a relatively poor example of a book addressing this question. In fact, I only discuss this, and this is also not my expertise, and I think that's another thing of writing a book where you start digging deeper into themes. At the end of that process, you start understanding what these themes are and that you should have had them from the beginning. So I need to write another book. This is just one of the big themes. I don't dare to mention some of the others, but I think climate and sustainability is one of the other big themes that I've totally missed. Or not missed, but I have them a little bit in my Swedish book. But yes, you're totally right. I think the kind of the use, the fungibility or the liquidity of wealth differs. I think so, and also I think wealth as a concept is problematic when it comes to thinking about the influence of middle class people. I think maybe it's not their money that they can be influential from, but rather maybe through other channels. So, and also when it comes to index fund and corporate governance that you talk about, how to think about that, it's a huge topic. Sweden has a long tradition of active owners. We've had these nivelated ownership rights of different shares in order to retain power in our traditional families, and we had a bank-centered corporate finance system, which is now maybe gradually shifting towards a bit more market-oriented system, like in the UK, US, where stock prices and these kinds of channels have been very important in governing firms. But this has also come with this power vacuum that you mentioned in terms of funds, mutual funds, pension funds becoming very large owners. If you talk to people in Sweden, I mean, they are concerned that they have silence, and then so the fund capitalism, how to think about that. And that's actually my recommendations on having more funded pension funds, for example, is not unproblematic in that sense. And in fact, when we introduced the pension system in the 1990s and having this share of our pension savings going into the premium pension funds, premiepensionen, they set the share of the contributions not too high because they felt that would swallow the entire stock exchange, and then bringing back the idea of the wage löntagarfond. I mean, so this is it's very paradoxical, and I'm happy to be here to kind of to start discussing and learning and thinking and maybe reaching conclusions. So I don't have any answers, but I'm just saying these are very important questions, and let's continue talking about them. Thank you.
If I may add, the mutual funds are called faceless capital, but the index funds are headless capital. There is no.
Yeah.
But that is a dramatic change, I think, that we haven't theorized enough what to do with. If nothing happens, the CEOs will increase their bonuses enormously because nobody checks them.
Yeah, I mean, the corporate governance. So people are looking at corporate governance. I think, and there's research on how good are these institutional investors in monitoring firms and so on. Yeah, okay. We could say more, but let's maybe come back to this. Sorry.
Thank you. Now we have Eva, political science again.
Actually, my question was Gustav's question about influence and power. But then I have another one. So I was curious about this debate. You present it as if there is an old narrative, and also the way you present it as an alternative explanation, and also the email from the Chicago guy saying this is the right story. Why would it have to be? Why isn't it equalizing? I mean, why isn't it both like slashing down the top due to wars, for instance, and this kind of growing cake? Why do you talk in such binary terms? Is that how it's? Does the debate look like in this respect?
Thank you for asking this question. Thomas Piketty told me at some point, I understand, Daniel, that you want to have maximum product differentiation in terms of So I mean, as we all know, the word is not black and white, binary in that sense, and straw manning is a classical rhetorical approach on how to approach past literatures, and I think to gain momentum and maybe also to ramp up interest is of course to try to create these tensions. Here, I think there's one for those of you who have followed Thomas Piketty and much of his research and so on. And he comes from a tradition of being very stark, also very political, ideological and political, and also being very transparent about that. And that I think is commendable. I mean, he's been openly helping out socialist candidates and so on, presidential elections and so on. Meaning also that I think I've talking to him and many of my other colleagues working with him, I had the kind of view of almost like the George W. Bush statement, like either you're with us or you're against us. They have a little bit of that attitude to these questions. So but which comes back, I think when it comes to the empirical part of the explanations for the equalization and lessons from that, we can look at it as a quantitative question. So in how much of the equalization is due to taking down the rich, or taking the rich, as the trade union leader in Norway talked about a few years ago, or lifting the bottom. So I think the order of magnitude shows that in terms of explanatory power is that it's lifting the bottom, and that is kind of almost completely absent, I think, from the basic narrative, and also framing the post-80 era in the neoliberal era as a great inequality reversal that is typically seen. It doesn't just come out from the data on wealth, and why? And I just want to show that and confront that narrative that have been, I think, although we have like these disclaimers in all of the writings and there are footnotes there, but I think so. This is a case actually where I think the two narratives are unusually different, and I think become starkly so, both in terms of factual and also interpretational.
Yeah, but they're sort of quite different, right? One is shock treatments, war, and the other is
Absolutely.
yeah, so they might be.
So the positive news the good news for society is that viewing the role of lifting the bottom, it also combines with wealth creation. So both expanding the pie and making the pie more equally distributed. Whereas, capital destruction channels are like maybe having more equality, but at the cost of destroying wealth. I think, luckily, we don't have that in history, but it's a really sad and destructive, I think, even view of how to generate equality.
Good. Then we move on to sociology. Malcolm.
Thanks. That was very impressive. Changed how I thought about some things. So thanks. I want to ask about two graphics. You can take either of these questions. Towards the end, you showed something that is one of the stylized facts that I think is so interesting about wealth inequality, which is Sweden has quite high wealth inequality. It's one of the most unequal societies, in the sort of category of countries you would put Sweden in. And I didn't hear you really explain that because, for example, Sweden has quite high home ownership, and yet it has this very high wealth inequality. So I'm interested in that. And then I'm wondering if you can skip back to your slide that had the age wealth profile.
Yeah,
because
in the very beginning.
You had, for me, possibly the most dramatic graphic of all on this page, which was buried, which is there.
This one, or?
Can you blow that up? Because what you're basically showing in that graphic is people accumulate tons of wealth up to age 60, and then they spend half of it in their next 10 years.
Let's see here. Now it becomes very complicated. Sorry for. Instead of blowing it up, I
look at what they do up to age 60, and then basically, in round figures, by age 70, they've killed half their own wealth.
Pensions.
But they eat it up.
Yeah,
they consume. They go.
Yeah,
so that's why. Their children say, mom and daddy, you're going to go on a safari. How nice! This is what explains this.
But
right?
they're consuming up their pensions.
Yeah, they're consuming up their wealth. This is
no, but
they don't pay into the pension and they consume it up.
I mean, obviously, I know people do these kinds of things, but skiing, spending the kids' inheritance, wow.
But you have to consume your pensions. You have no choice.
Some of it could be inter vivos gifts, so they give to their children. Also, we see that it's maybe 1/10 of total transfers, maybe on average, is that they give away maybe some of it. But you think that this is very rapid decrease, right?
I think
Surely
it's a
the
scandal.
consumption of pensions. You have to consume your pensions. You're not paying anymore, and you have to take it out.
Yeah.
Well, I think this is more immoral than a lot of other people here clearly believe. But my question is related to something you said kind of about the life course, which is you said, I'm paraphrasing, but because people lived longer, they accumulated more wealth. And I don't really get that. Wouldn't they actually, because it seems to me it's more complicated than that, because most of the extension of life expectancy occurs obviously after the working years. So
no, so the idea was that this build-up that we see up until retirement is kind of contingent on you living past retirement. But if you would die off at 65, why save for life after 65? So this is the idea. If we become
people have an
better
incentive to save much more if you expect to live much longer. If you expect to die, you don't do that.
So it's
a classical economist kind of trick.
I see what you're
So
saying.
Isaac Asimov have a novel, I don't recall its name, but when the thought experiment in a future society when everybody were kind of killed off at age 65, compulsory, because so this is why people, that's a kind of the reason for saving is to have something to live off when you don't earn anymore.
Give to your kids, isn't that standard economist explanation?
But that's another reason. That's a challenge to this stylized life cycle profile. So we have wealth also when we die. Either it's accidental because we cannot time perfectly. We don't know exactly when we're going to die. So accidental bequest hypothesis that we have some left because we want to eat it up, but we don't know when we die. Or all of a sudden we die and then there is some left. The other would be bequest motives. We want to give to our children, and that is, I think, is quite natural. Also, that's another reason for.
Okay,
That's also another reason for this.
So maybe this is less interesting to others than it is to me. But setting this one aside, can you explain Sweden?
Oh yeah.
That was part of my question. He didn't take in all those pensions that we have, state pensions and stuff.
So maybe I'm screwing this graphics up by fixing on the. I don't know if this is even possible now. Yeah, I can do it a little bit. So, 1 minute exposé on Sweden. So we had this. Okay, it doesn't really show.
You have a comparative graphic there. You just skipped past it.
What one?
I think it was the one where you. Yeah, there.
So Sweden. So I'm just one result that has come out is that Sweden has an unusually high or relatively high degree of wealth inequality. So this is partly because of our welfare system. So people have not saved. I think for old age or so. I mean, this is. But
you don't have the claims in there in your measure. That's what explains a lot. Lots of the claims that you have are not calculated in the wealth that you're using here.
So no, definitely. So this is not a lot of the wealth. The pension wealth is not in here. So to say, the part of the kind of the future incomes, pension incomes that you will have, but which you are tax financing. You're paying. You cannot save privately because you're paying taxes for that. But there are some artifacts of our early 2000s data that did not have any of even the funded pension savings in the old statistics Sweden data that has shown Sweden.
But if all this is true of your Swedish data, what about all the other countries' data?
No, that's right. But you're okay. So you're asking why Sweden is here and not here.
Yeah.
Okay. Now I understand your question. Sorry. It's I think it's then combination of the structure of our kind of welfare system and how we have had. I mean, all of these countries don't have the exact same setups. Some of them have a larger degree of private savings and so on. Here we also have in Sweden, but we also have potentially. I know we have a high degree of. Successful entrepreneurs and world-leading companies having like large fortunes being generated. We have billionaires and more perhaps in looking at the Forbes listing of global billionaires, Sweden is clearly overrepresented. So this is part of also the story of having a thicker right tail of the distribution.
I just think it challenges, the old sort of Esping Anderson, social democratic Sweden. Like here it is, more unequal than, bad old liberal UK.
Yeah,
I think you should be careful with that, given all these claims are not counted in this. I mean, this is also confusing why we're looking at more home ownerships.
But Gustav, if the data on Sweden are bad, what does that imply about the data on all the other countries?
Some countries like the United States doesn't have the same system, but other countries, Finland and France, are interesting. I wonder about that too.
Yeah.
Why they are so much lower than Sweden. But I say it's tricky because it depends.
I think so data are not exactly comparable in this graph to begin with. I think Sweden is we have more successful entrepreneurs and a thicker right tail than Finland. I think, but the degree of taxes is high in Sweden, but there's also high in Finland. Okay, I stop there. We could go into other granularities, but.
Okay, it's a fascinating question. Just to follow up on that, I mean, there are other things you don't count. For example, you were talking. We have home ownership in some countries, especially in Eastern Europe. But people also have a claim on an apartment if you can't buy one. You have a system that gives them apartment. That's also a kind of wealth. That doesn't show up in this.
I think, in fact, when it comes to Esping Andersen and so on, I think maybe wealth as an outcome is maybe not the most kind of encompassing or most kind of appropriate to think about when thinking about our drawing rights on the welfare system and our living standards and so on. I think maybe we want to either have a multidimensional outcome thing or maybe looking perhaps more on broader measures of income to capture that.
We have so many questions, we shouldn't hog it. Karim, you need a microphone.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about tax havens. So your colleagues have said in 2017, I think, that about 15% of the wealth of 1% in the US is in tax havens, and of the 0.01%, 30 to 50% of wealth. Is this included in your numbers, or yeah?
I think for the most part, not. So the main numbers don't have tax haven data. So they're in the book I have. I don't have that graph here. Maybe no, I don't. I showed that data for a few years. Data are difficult. I would say for the US, in fact, it has less of offshore, hidden offshore wealth than many other Western countries. Partly because they have maybe better tax, like more positive for them tax contexts within the U.S. We also know that if you're kind of convicted on hiding taxes, you can lose your citizenship and stuff. But it's not part of. So I think what my main theme would still be that it doesn't change any of the main conclusions. Those amounts are just not large enough. They could be interesting in some addressing some questions, but it doesn't change the broad picture both in terms of the trends and the levels. It's just not enough wealth.
But it's if 30 to 50% of the wealth of the 0.01% are in tax havens. I mean, there are onshore and offshore tax havens in the US, of course. I mean, Delaware and so on. I mean, wouldn't that change the picture?
No, I mean, maybe if you have that graph with the top 1% graph that I showed you, it could tilt it up somewhat, going from having 6% to maybe then 7.5% or I don't know 8%. So it doesn't change quantitatively, qualitatively, I think. But it's of course a quantitative address that we may want to think about and address. And I think this is maybe also then something that is being addressed with these information exchange institutions that have now come about. But it doesn't change at all this kind of picture. Just there's too few of these people, and in the aggregate, the amounts of people's home values or pension funds, their private savings, these are just totally dwarfed by that. So but it depends on the question.
Henrik, you've been waiting for a long time.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Very interesting. I recently read an article about a study that was looking into how many years it takes for a person to save up to buy a home. And I looked at this for different decades. So in the 80s or 70s, it took like maybe a few years, 4 or 5 years, for a person with an average income to save up to a home in the Stockholm area. That number today is like 30 years, from what I hear. And that's of course because of rising house prices, right? So you can describe this as like we've become richer. But it's also a story of how it's become increasingly hard for people to buy a home in, urban areas mainly. So, yeah, how do you put these stories together? Because one story kind of tells you that we have actually become poorer because we can't afford to buy homes anymore.
At least more unequal.
Yeah, right.
No, but that's a very, very important point, and this is another big discussion: the housing market, the housing cost questions, and so on. I think so. There are new gaps. There are always gaps. There are many gaps out there. That's also one of the challenges of discussing these things, because there's like not one inequality or one gap. the generational gap, if you may, the young people coming in and wanting to buy a home. First of all, it's true. This has happened. One implication is for the future, if we would have continued house price increases, how to think about having more people being part of that positive wealth increasing process, i.e. making more people owning their homes. I think that is kind of to lifting that bottom as well, not seeing that some people who have owned the homes have taken away in these house price increases as something negative. It's positive for them, and for those who have not been there, it's a shame. But so you seem to have one.
Yeah. I was just thinking that a lot of this wealth is probably older people in urban areas, right? That's a large part of this increase. And so they might have gotten very much wealthier, but they have children and grandchildren who they basically have to give this money to for them to be able to own buy a house. So, I mean, we're
Thomas
richer.
Piketty makes the same point, actually.
We're richer, but like in another sense, it doesn't feel like that, right?
So, I mean, okay. So there will be inheritance in this sense has actually a wealth inequality decrease in effect. So there were a lot of wealthless young households who will receive inheritances from their maybe lucky parents who have been part of this journey. I'm just thinking about this is kind of how it looks, and value increases is kind of positive thing, and there may be some of these disparities across these groups. How to think about that? There is like no catch-all answer to that. So we can think about maybe taxation, taxing some of these gains to kind of distribute the gains more equally. We think that is good, and finding a good way of taxing home ownership or housing and so on. That's one way to thinking about that. Of course, otherwise adjusting, your life choices. There will be some people wanting, maybe they would be needing to spend more of their income on housing if they prefer to live centrally in Stockholm. There are cheaper housing, by the way, if you want to live in Västerås or in Österåker or like somewhere else. So
what about increasing the supply?
Thank you for that. I mean, to increasing the supply, one of the reasons of the house prices increases is, of course, problems in construction markets. Why? Well, I don't know, regulations in these decision structures and so on. Some municipalities have been are probably better than others, and how to learn from that institutionally. So, i.e., some kind of policy failures, maybe even. But we need to talk more about this, and I don't talk sufficiently about it. Just I think I become very instrumental in my wealth inequality analysis. I just see the home values and I look at the distributional effects. But then there are other follow-up questions like the one you ask, which are very important. That maybe, it gives me inspiration to do more. This is not the last book about wealth inequality.
Note. Join me in thanking for this excellent talk.
Thanks.
We feel enlightened. And welcome back. We have March 5th, Åsa Wikfors, going to talk about bad beliefs and knowledge resistance. And then we have March 12th, Lena Wengerud, why women's political representation affect levels of corruption, trends in bribery and public service delivery across European regions. A very long title. And March 19th, we have Patricia Minders, our own Patricia Minders, and Rebecca Torben. They're going to speak something that will be announced. You're very welcome.